How pernicious will negative rates be in Britain? Is it a one-off of a troubled moment, or are they here to stay?
So I think we should look at the big picture here. I think there's been too much attempt to think of this situation in terms of conventional language, like a recession or a depression, a downturn, and assume, therefore, that central banks have a responsibility for getting us out of it. I think that's a mistake. This isn't a recession caused by the private sector being reluctant to spend. This is being caused by a government-mandated shutdown of the economy. And it doesn't make much sense for the government to shut down the economy with one hand and then to pretend that we need monetary and fiscal stimulus with the other hand. We're going to have to wait until the restrictions are lifted completely and then decide what sort of stimulus, if any, is needed. But my concern would be that if you look ahead, it's quite hard to see how we're going to be able to go back to anything close to normal until we have a vaccine or until there is population immunity. That's quite a long way away. And in the meanwhile, it's not going to be easy, given what governments have said in the past 2 months, to persuade people to take risks of going back to work, to use public transport, to use restaurants, theatres and bars. The idea that somehow a slightly lower interest rate is going to assuage their concern and make them more likely to spend in the near term doesn't seem to me very helpful. So I think the whole question of monetary stimulus is something which really is for the medium term and not for the immediate set of circumstances. And I think Andrew Bailey hinted at that yesterday when he said, understandably, that he's not ruling out negative rates, but he's certainly not ruling them in either. And it will take time to assess whether or not that would be an appropriate step to take.
What will be the effect of negative rates on a much more Anglo-American London, a much more financial London versus the more old world structures of continental European banking? It's got to be different in London, in Edinburgh, across all of the United Kingdom. How will negative rates or ultra low rates be different for commercial banking in the UK?
So one of the reasons why we didn't introduce negative interest rates in the financial crisis was because of the damage it would have done to the banking system. What's happened in continental Europe, where they have gone for negative interest rates, is that in essence, they are flooding the system with liquidity. They're almost subsidizing the banking system in Europe to prevent it from failing. The European banking system is very much weaker than the UK banking system. But I just don't think it's credible to believe that a long-term solution to the problems we're facing can be achieved by moving interest rates from plus 0.1% to, say, minus 0.1%. This is not really the issue. The challenge we face now is not for central banks, it's for governments. And I think we're suffering somewhat from the feeling which has gained ground both inside central banks and outside, that central banks are the only game in town. If there's any reason for the economy slowing, central banks must provide stimulus. But the reasons for slowing matter. And the current reason why the economy is in such deep, deep trouble has nothing to do with the level of aggregate demand that we were facing prior to COVID-19. It's got everything to do with the measures which governments understandably have decided they need to take to slow the spread of the virus. But that does not mean to say that monetary stimulus is the answer to our problems. It isn't.
Lord King, how would you, good morning from Francine from London, how would you describe the current government scheme in terms of furloughs also being extended? Is it helpful? Could they have done better? Is the money getting to the right places in the right time?
Well, good morning, Francine. I think the government did exactly the right thing to introduce a furlough type scheme. I think that in a situation like this, it is vital to prevent private sector businesses, whether large or small, or the self-employed, from getting into such financial difficulty that they have to close their doors. We cannot afford to allow businesses to go bankrupt at this stage. In essence, the government has suspended the market economy for the time being. And in that situation, you need to support businesses. I think the government's extended the length of the furlough scheme. I think that was sensible. I think we'll see. I mean, we have no idea how we will get out of this and when we'll be able to return to normal, because we don't yet have a vaccine that can be spread across the population. We don't have treatment. And people, I think, have come to terms with the fact that social distancing is here to stay for the time being. It's uncomfortable. It makes it difficult to work. I think businesses have been very ingenious in finding ways in which they can adapt their business to be consistent with social distancing. But nevertheless, there are major problems like public transport and so on, where we simply don't have a solution to how as many people as before could go to work with the existing capacity for public transport. So I think this isn't a matter of giving people financial incentives to stimulate spending. It's a question of supporting the private sector until such point as we can say the COVID-19 crisis is behind us because we have a vaccine.
Right. But by certain accounts, right, the UK could borrow up to £300 billion. How do we pay for all of this debt?
So one of the reasons why being prudent with the public finances over the past decade was a good thing was that we went into this crisis in a position that we could afford to have a sharp rise in the ratio of national debt to national income. That's why we have a national debt, to cope with extraordinary and unusual emergencies. Some countries like Italy were not in that position, and they're struggling as a result. If we can get through to the point where we know we have a vaccine, at that point, and not before that point, it will be sensible for the government to review its budget. It may decide it wants to spend more on spending for improving the resilience of the health service. If it does that, it has to decide whether it will finance that by cutting spending elsewhere or by raising taxes modestly to do that. It shouldn't require a massive expenditure. And the higher level of national debt can then be financed by allowing the ratio of national debt to national income slowly to reduce over time as the economy grows. And at current long-term real interest rates at which the government can borrow, then it is very likely that simply having a normal rate of economic growth would in fact imply that the ratio of national debt to national income would steadily fall. Because the thing we have to remember is that the payments that are being made now by the Treasury to the private sector are transfer payments. They're not an economic cost to the economy. The real cost to the economy, and the thing we need to focus on, is the lost incomes, the lost output, and lost jobs, and the lost GDP resulting from the... We need now to find a way back to restore that level of GDP closer to where it was before COVID-19 hit us.